So the purpose of this little short video is to answer a question that came up on our group about how to create a motif in Digitizer MBX version 5 and have that motif that has been created not be full of jump stitches. So when I answered the question initially, I did mention that the main thing that needed to help eliminate jump stitches was that your motif would be created from left to right, because that is going to be the logical direction that MBX version 5 wants to stitch a motif out in. Another thing that goes along with left to right in the way that the motifs have been created is that when you actually use them to digitize an object or a shape, you are also going to want to stitch that or create that digitized shape from left to right. So let's say, for example, that it is a circle shape that you're using a motif for. You're going to want to digitize that line in a clockwise motion to make that circle as it stitches out. If it was a straight line, you would want it to go from left to right. So I hope as you're watching my cursor on the screen, left to right it would be stitching this direction. Let's say you're making a square, left to right would be top to bottom. So it would be going in this direction, okay? Just in a clockwise motion. So hopefully I can keep that phrase left to right straight as I'm talking about creating this little motif, because I may get confused and say right to left accidentally, but it's always going to be left to right. Okay, so what you're going to see on my screen right now is that I have set up a Digitizing, just a little guideline, and what I've done is I've just select out in the margin if you've not done this before, and you can create a line just by clicking in the ruler section so that you can have a little guideline for how you're going to create your shape. Okay, and that's just because what I'm planning to make for you is a little pointed design, and I just want to make sure that my design points are straight on a line. Okay, so because I already had one there and I just showed you how to do another one in case you didn't know, I'm going to delete that one by dragging it out. And I'm going to start creating my little shape. I'm going to come to the Digitizing toolbar and I am going to create a digitized closed shape. So I will turn that function on. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here, and I'm going to make sure that my fill is selected up here on my toolbar, because I want to make a filled design, not a line design. Very simple one. I'm just going to do a left click, left click, left click. Notice how I use that little ruler to keep my point straight. I will hit OK, my enter button, and boy, does that look like a mess. Interesting, and I don't know if it's just because of the shape or the size that I just made that in. Fill line. So there's my object that I made. I'm going to delete it because I'm going to make something just a little bit bigger. Okay. Hopefully this one comes out a little better. Digitize, fill. Right now it's, here we go. A little better, hopefully. All right. It looks like a mess, and I want to do two things. I want to look at it. This is in the stitch mode. If I have it in true view mode, you're going to see this horrible little shape, and I think it's really quite tiny. Actually, is one of the reasons why this is not coming out very well. But it looks really bad, partly because this tiny little motif is in a tatami fill, which is also known as a weave fill, and I'm not going to want it to be created in a weave fill. So I'm going to turn it into a satin. I'm going to enlarge it just a little bit because it looks pretty tiny there. You will notice the stitches are all at an angle, not pleasing to my way of what I want my little pointed design to look at. So the first thing is that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the stitch angle. So because my little shape has been created and it is selected, I'm going to come to the reshape tool. First thing you're going to see that I'm going to move is the angle of the stitches. Right now they're set at 15. I guess that must have been the default on there. I'm just going to drag the line up and move it to a 90. So you'll see how all my stitches have now been translated into this 90-degree angle. Much better. Second thing you're going to notice is you're going to see a lot of underlay in here. Now, whether or not you want underlay in your motifs is going to be up to you and depending on what you're creating your stitch for. But as an example, I think that I do not want any underlay in my object. So object is still selected. I will come to the stitching properties and I am going to unselect the underlay button. So you'll notice that most of the underlay disappeared. But what you are still going to see is you're going to be seeing some travel lines in here. This here is just the jump where the motif is going to start from the center point of my hoop over. In a little while we'll correct that. But this little line that's in here is also a little travel line. And the reason why it's there is because these are your starting and end points that need to be put into the position where you want them to be. If you haven't done much digitizing, you may not yet know that the green diamond is the beginning of the object shape that you have made, and the red cross is the end of the object that you have just created. So I like where my starting point is. Remember, we're going to be stitching from left to right. So that's in a good spot, but my ending point, no, I don't want it up there. I want it down here at the end of the object shape. Okay, so the direction this is going to now stitch in is it's going to come all the way, and it's going to end here. But you see all these extra stitches in here? Those are the little connectors. Connectors are also basically little knots that are going to be stitched into your motif as this is being used. So I don't want any knots at the end of my motif because that would just make a big clogged up shape as this was stitching out in the when it's being used actually to create a motif line. So over here again in your stitching toolbar, there's a couple of things that I would also like to change before I get rid of that. One of them is my spacing of my stitches. Most of your embroidery thread, if it's a 40 weight thread, it's going to be about 4 millimeters thick. And so 0.36 is the default on how close these stitches are spaced together. And I typically like to space them out to about 0.4 or 0.5. Okay, and I don't want this motif to split. I would just like it to be a smooth satin. So I'm going to say okay on that. And then I am going to come back to stitching, and under stitching I'm going to get rid of these connectors. So I want my tie-in, which is a knot. I want to have that turned off, and I definitely want my tie-off turned off. And now you'll notice that more stitches have been removed from this little shape, this object shape that I have made. So I'm going to turn off the reshape tool. I'm hoping it'll turn off. That's a little strange. Escape. Okay, I hit the escape button to get it to go away. I'm going to put this in the middle of my hoops. I will select my object. I will come down to my layout tool. I will say that I want to center this to the work area. See how it moved over just a little bit? Hit the enter button and it is now centered in my hoop. One other thing that you might want to consider is that whenever you create a motif, it is always going to be colored in whatever the first color is on your color toolbar. So in my case, it's the default of red because I think this template that I'm using is the Janome colors. And I may not want this to be red. So what I can do with it is I can change it at this point. And let's just say, for example, I want to change it into this sky blue color. The motif, once it is saved, is going to retain that color. So every time you use it to create a design, it's going to digitize in blue in this situation. But that does not mean that it has to stay blue. Obviously, you can change the color once you've digitized your line. One other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to come back to my reshape tool, double check that my start point is here and my end point is there. Yes, it is. Next thing is to make this into a motif. I think you know how to do that part, but we'll just go over it real quickly. It's in your advanced digitized toolbar. Create a motif. Next thing that comes up is what category am I going to store this in? The last place I stored a design was FaviMTZ. I was practicing on this a little while ago. I'm going to name my design and I'm going to call it Pointy. I'm going to say OK. Now this is telling me that I already have a design with that name. Do I want to override it with this one? And I will say yes in this case. All right, it is ready to create it into a motif. Down here on the bottom left, it says to enter the start point of the reference line. Where your reference line is at is whenever you digitize a line using a motif, how you draw that line is also known as the reference line. So let's say, for example, that when I draw my lines, I want it to be at the base of this pointy shape that I have made. It's also possible that I might want my reference line to be somewhere in the middle or even at the top. But basically, it's when you lay down the nodes for the motif line that you are creating, where is this shape going to fall on that line? Okay, so I hope that makes sense, but I want mine to be at the bottom, so my first point will be here, bottom left. To enter the end point of the reference line, I'm going to have it be over here on the bottom right. All right, this has been created. I will say OK. Hitting my escape button. The next thing that I like to do, and you will notice I didn't even pay attention to my little digitizing reference line, but that's okay. I also like to always practice with my line, with my motif, by creating a couple of lines with it after I have created it, just so that I can see how it's going to stitch out. So I will come over to Digitize. I'm going to digitize an open line. I will come over here to my object property bars, and I want my motif to be selected. So this is the last design I saved, and it happens to be the first one that shows up here in the object property bar. So I'm just going to do a left click, a right click, and a left click to create a line. And there's my little pointed motif. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to see how this stitches out. So I will turn on the player. And here it goes. Notice that one still wanted to stitch out with the point in a funny spot. But here comes my line that I digitized. And it looks like my connectors are working pretty well. So one thing to also notice about motifs is that you will also be able to move these along the line. You will be able to change the spacing of them and do many different things with them after they have been created. And that is basically how to create a motif. The main point being that we wanted to make sure that you weren't having a whole bunch of jump stitches. This is a satin fill, and you of course can do designs in straight stitches or all kinds of stuff. It's a fun tool to use, and the learning curve is not that difficult, but just a lot of experimenting is going to be necessary. So I hope that this answered your questions sufficiently, and if it did not, go ahead and reply back on the group, and I'd be happy to try to help you some more. Okay? Have fun!